Hello, welcome to another episode of Awakening with Soulspirational. Also, the Bared Soul. The guys, so Steve Young and Rick Stetler and myself, we've just recently created a new YouTube channel called The Bared Soul. So some of these videos I'm going to share both here at WCTV on my YouTube page, which is Soulspirational, and then also The Bared Soul. So you may see both of those sites at the bottom of the screen, and that's why. All right. Anyway, welcome back. And today, for this video, we're going to talk about the ego. And it's a really deep subject. I know we could branch off in different ways with ego. We're also all currently reading A Course in Miracles, and that just has brought a lot of things up too with ego. So anyway, do you guys want me to start, or is there something that comes to mind that you want to start the process of ego?
You can start. I'll feed in.
Me too.
Oh, that's them stepping out of ego, right?
It
Just
is.
being of light, like you do, Tish. So maybe not. So, all right. When I think of ego, actually, I'm going to pull up something that Steve had said just a few moments ago of conditioning, right? Of when we're born and the ego develops. For me, and I'm sure we're gonna go down that path as well. For me, when I think of ego, I remind myself that I'm not operating from my place of light, my internal light. And sometimes I'm reminded then in that moment that maybe there's something that needs to be healed, or something that I'm still unlearning, so to speak, from ego. And I also remind myself, and I'm just kind of throwing out some surface points that we can get into, that we are still human, regardless of how spiritual a person may be. We are still subject to ego because it has been with us our entire being as we've been alive. So that trigger, or
Yeah. I'm going to jump into the thought that I had before the video started about ego essentially being the comfort zone that we live in, because ego uses the programming that's in our subconscious that we learn from our conditioning, that in our childhood either kept us safe or kept us feeling good, and then at some point those things no longer really work for us, but we default to them anyways until we become aware that they are no longer working for us. And then we start looking at attempting to approach that programming to say, how can I change that so that I can expand past where I'm at in any given moment. But ego steps in and says, no, you don't want to do that. You're fine right here where you're at because this feels good. But you still have that nagging feeling inside of you that says, but it also doesn't feel good. I want more. I want something different. This is feeling stuck or stagnant kind of a thing. So I kind of look at the ego and comfort zone as closely related, where it helped at one point, but now you've kind of plateaued on certain things, and it takes the awareness of looking at it to possibly set ego to the side.
getting to the point where the comfort zone is that place of light within you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, because the way I feel about it when it happens to me is that place of light inside me fills me with inspiration that takes me to new places and doing new things and creating new in my life and in others' lives.
Getting you out of the ego comfort zone.
Yes. And so when I'm going from a place of that inspiration, being in alignment with my inner being, it's always constant change. It's constant expansion. So when I'm in alignment, I do feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, because the growth doesn't feel scary. When you're in alignment, say I'm speaking right now about these videos and I feel it coming out and through me and I'm inspired and I'm talking, I'm not having fear about what I'm going to say or what I look like when I'm saying it, because it's exciting to me, and I'm going whichever direction this inner being is taking me in. And so not having that fear or that ego cap, so to speak, put on, where it's like, no, you don't want to go past this, or you're okay right where you're at. That's not the case. It's wherever expansion goes, it still feels good when you're coming from that place of alignment.
I think ego is limited. Ego is like you guys were saying, is your safe place. Personally, I look at, and we all have a different way of looking at ego. I look at ego being a reverend. I look at ego as a separation from God. But the ego in my lifetime has saved me a lot of times. Ego is not necessarily a bad thing, but it keeps you from expanding and growing. You have to look at it from a certain point of view, or, it's like, well, this doesn't feel right to me anymore. But the ego is telling you, now, that's not what you learned. You didn't learn that in church. You didn't learn that from what your parents told you. But the ego, well, in my view, will hold you down. If you start to release that a little bit and look into the spiritual realms, and from that point of view, the ego will contend with you. It does with me all the time, and I'm constantly learning. To me, I tend to look at the ego more these days as the enemy, because it's holding me back from my spiritual growth, from realizing who I really am, that I'm a spirit with a body, not a body with a spirit. I can tap into certain things, I can do certain things that before I became aware of this was closed to me, because the ego was shutting it down. It's like, no. How dare you think this way? This is not what you were told. You're going against convention. It's like sometimes we need to open up to realize more of ourselves and put convention aside a little bit and see, and you have to find this out for yourself. I can't tell you from my perspective that this is the way it's got to be, and that's all. We've had that our whole lives. From now, you got to look at it from the point of view, it's what is right for me, okay? And you'll find that the ego, as much as it's helped you in your life, can also work against you in your life. And that's the point I'm coming from it too.
And I think, and I feel that, ego is a human aspect that helps us filter what goes on in our lives and helps us try to comprehend and understand. From that viewpoint, it's also limited to the logical mind, and only what the mind can comprehend. So anything that's outside of the physical, the non-physical, past the 5 basic senses, the ego can't wrap its so-called mind around. And it says, well, wait a second, that's not part of the programming that we've had since we've come into life here on this earth. Mm-hmm. So let's shove that to the side and pretend that doesn't exist. That's not the case. I don't want to look at ego as an enemy. I want to look at, for myself, I want to look at ego as a filter that helps me look at myself in any given moment, and where do I stand with my alignment at that point. Is how I'm feeling in regards to what's happening in this moment in alignment with myself, or am I feeling like I'm teetering towards the side of ego to help me then course correct?
So let's pull up, what do you guys see as red flags of ego?
One red flag of ego that comes to mind immediately is the mindset of scarcity, of lack. So when someone feels like they're in lack and thus they need to keep things from other people, they're operating from ego. Because much with energy is abundant and unlimited and always there. And if you think about love being the purest form of energy, the restriction of love to or from somebody is an operation of ego. And for somebody to give love to another person and yet not lose any love inside of them, ego can't wrap its mind around that. So I look at the restriction of something like that as a red flag of ego.
So whatever that lack may be, whether it's love, finances, maybe other emotions, do you see red flags? What is a red flag that you can
Control.
think of?
Control, when you're trying to control people with your thoughts and opinions, that's definitely, in my view, a point of ego. It's like, you know, when your point of view is the only point of view and nobody has another point of view, and you have to accept that's something I think that works against your soul, it works against you as a person. But, you know, we could talk about ego for months. I mean, there's so much about ego that we can't do in a 25-minute video. But it's just like, you know, all three of us are at a different point in our lives about what we think ego is. You know, me, I would guess I'm a little bit harsher on the ego than most people are. But it's just, ego has, for all that it's helped me in my life, it's really hurt me in my life. And when I'm looking at it from a point of control, you know, it's just like I can offer what I know. And if people don't want to accept it, that's fine. But all I ask people to do is look at it from that point of view. Don't be so dogmatic about what you've known all your life. Open yourself up a little bit. Because there's so much you can learn, and we're on this journey, all of us together, to learn what we can learn to get us through this thing we call life and this journey. And Tish has a different point of view. Steve has a different point of view. I have mine, but we all come together on some parts. And we're all growing. We're all learning.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like I said, if there's something in this video that I say to you that you just don't agree with, okay, don't agree with it, but take the time to check it out. That's all I ask, is take the time to check it out.
And what's the standard saying? Take what works, discard what doesn't.
Exactly.
Because sometimes too, even as we are evolving, things that don't make sense at one point or we don't agree with at one point may later, you may, or vice versa, you may agree with something now later that you don't. Yeah, it's ego. I don't necessarily see it as I get where you're coming from, is seeing it as an enemy, because it can really trip one up. I've also kind of learned to speak with the ego, so I can, because I recognize and if I ever do release ego, that it's part of me. So if I were to hate my ego, I'm hating a part of me. So I do from time to time, listen to it. What are you trying to tell me? Whatever the situation may be, that's my red flag, because I'm in an uncomfortable position. Maybe I'm upset about something, or I'm feeling disempowered in some way. That kind of reminds me of what you were saying earlier too. Whatever it may happen to be, so I stop to become more conscious of why it is that I'm feeling uncomfortable, so I can address the ego. And yes, it would be wonderful if at some point I like to think that the more that I am growing and evolving, and I can look back, and it's measurable, so to speak, of how often ego popped up 10, 15, 20 plus years ago, as opposed to in more recent years. It has become quieter the more that I tap into the divine light within. The less ego is. I sometimes see it like a little kid trying to get my attention, and becoming consciously aware that something is off here, whatever that may be, so I can take a look at that.
You touched on feeling uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note that we should take the time for ourselves to explore what we're actually feeling.
Mm-hmm.
See what's surfacing, what's coming to the surface, and figuring out for ourselves where it came from and what's the meaning behind it. If we're feeling uncomfortable, that doesn't automatically mean it's the ego speaking. If we're feeling uncomfortable, it doesn't automatically mean it's our own energy.
But you know what, with that, all right, let's use an example. Let's say, you know, obviously the guys are my buds, right? Maybe one of them does something that crosses a boundary, I'll say. I don't know, but let me kind of talk this through and see if this makes sense. And I am afraid of speaking to them because I may have a fear that if I speak to them that I'm going to lose them. And by looking at it, it may be a fear of abandonment or a fear of rejection that I'm feeling. So there's some kind of fear where, for me, when I think of fear, I think of ego. Because again, for me, as I'm in that place of light, I can lovingly get my point across and know that if what I said now, if I'm saying something in a very rude, crude manner, they have every right to be like, you've crossed my boundary, see ya. But if I'm approaching it with love and respect, I also know that, you know, people come and go in life, and either way I'm going to be fine. I'm still going to be me, with or without. And I enjoy them in my life. I want to keep them here. But am I making sense with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when we become consciously aware and having those conversations with ego, we can see it. And this is actually what I do when I'm doing my own personal healing. So if I'm seeing that, oh my gosh, it's a sense of abandonment, well, where did that sense of abandonment come up? So I can go back. For me, it's an unlearning, an unconditioning, so to speak, of when my ego was forming at an early age, feeling that sense of abandonment, the ego feeling as though it was protecting me at the time, because I wasn't taught, nor did I have the capacity as a young child to think about, oh, God within me, that divine light that's within me. Because even when the adults were talking about it, I still didn't understand it. I couldn't comprehend what that meant. So yeah, being able to go back to those moments to address them.
And I think it's also important that, much like how we, as spiritual people and practitioners of helping in the healing process for others, hold space for people to present their issues or emotions and not abandon them, so that they feel safe, that they got this thing out, and that fear of abandonment can subside.
Seen and heard.
Seen and heard.
Absolutely.
That we also do that for ourselves when it comes to our own ego. So when we're having a feeling inside that really is coming from our ego trying to protect us, but it's preventing us from growing, that we don't then abandon ourselves in that moment, that we stay there and we stay present with ourselves while we're dealing with our ego.
Boy, especially if we've been abandoned before, to show that we ourselves are standing up in that place that people left before.
Yeah,
And when we fill it with our own being, it's
If you can feel yourself walking through ego popping up out of fear of abandonment, like the example that Tish was using earlier, the fear of saying something that would cause a loss of a friendship or a loss of a conversation for the day, and just say, you know what, I'm going to sit with myself in this feeling, and I'm going to say this question even to myself mentally, and then allow that fear to arise, and I'm going to sit here with myself and make sure that my human body knows that I'm okay to say this without the repercussions actually happening that I'm fearing. And as that subsides and you know that you're still there with yourself, you can feel that comfort flow through your body that says, I don't quite know why I was fearing that when it didn't happen. And I've proven to myself that I can do this without that happening.
Not only that, you have to approach it from a compassionate point of view. I do not claim to know I know everything about ego. I'm still learning. There's processes that we're all going to go through, that we have to learn things. But being compassionate with yourself might be the first thing to learn, because you don't know it all. I don't know everything, but from being around these two guys, I can learn a lot of stuff through them, and I hope they can learn something from me from time to time. But it's just like, it's a process. You're not going to learn everything in one day, and don't beat yourself up if you don't. It just doesn't, you got to give yourself some time and space here. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to maybe not recognize an ego moment and just go with it. But, just allow yourself to learn about ego and how to work with ego, and I don't know, give yourself a chance.
There's like a sense of a defense mechanism popping up when ego starts to come into play, where you can kind of feel yourself bracing, and that could be like an alert or a notification to you that in this moment ego stepping forward, and when you're feeling that, you're in a sense aligning with ego because you felt that way about it in that moment. You could use that as the opportunity to kind of step back out of that energy of the defense mechanism, the bracing, the hunkering down, and just allow the energy to expand itself in that moment, so that you aren't caught up in whatever that default programming is that you might be going back to. Because it's so easy for us on a daily basis to just revert to whatever autopilot programming we've been doing every other day. Especially when traumatic situations happen. If somebody triggers us on any given thing that we are triggered by, you can tell, if you are looking at yourself in hindsight or even in the moment, that you might default to a certain action immediately without thought process. And that kind of shows you where your programming lies when dealing with that kind of a conflict.
And it is a process to deprogram.
Yeah.
And I want to just kind of double back with what Rick was saying, in that this is what I've done for myself. I've helped plenty of others, of being kind and compassionate to yourself. As we become more and more consciously aware, it may be that I'm catching myself 10-15 minutes after a situation, and I do that X number of times. It could be 2 times, it could be 150 times, X number of times. And so eventually I can catch myself in the act itself for X number of times. Then eventually getting to where I can catch myself before that active ego. And then we have an opportunity to change things. But we have been so conditioned, and some of us have been around for a while. And that's why I'm saying this too. It's from experience that it takes a while to right the ship, so to speak. So be kind with yourself in the meantime. Know that you're getting your footing with this, that it's going to make sense. There are still times where I get caught up, and that there are other times where I may recognize somebody else's defensiveness, and I'm not here to compete with somebody else, say. But if somebody feels that, I recognize that in them, because I know what it feels like. I'm consciously aware of it within myself, and there's a state of grace and allowing somebody to be in that moment of ego without judgment, without scorn, seeing that so can pass by, and then moving on from that.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing when you can realize, wait a minute, is this me or is this ego, or what is this? What's going on here? To be aware of that is just something in itself. Just to have that beautiful, gosh, it's great to be at this point in my life where I can, work with ego or work around it, or just be aware of the ego as a play here. As human beings, if we could all learn that a little step at a time, life would be so much better, so much easier.
Some of the emotions or the wounds, if we talked about things like Gene Keys and human design, they talk about having core wounds in your life, themes that you are to heal from. And guilt and shame come to mind for me when I think about how I should be past certain points, or I should have gotten through healing of specific triggers. So when a trigger happens, and say I default to that, whatever that mechanism is that I default to, I'll start feeling shameful in myself for not being past that. And it's the actual living of the life processes to where you're learning about yourself and expanding yourself. That,
How awesome is that?
yeah, and
Yeah.
if any time you ever have a new experience, think about this. If any time you ever have a new experience in life, you're also going to learn something new about yourself, because you will learn what your own response or reaction will be to that new thing, and you won't know that until you've experienced that experience. So for anybody who also might have felt guilt or shame for thinking, I thought I knew myself completely, I thought I knew everything about myself, who I am and what I want in life, and now I'm finding out that there's different things that I want, or I'm thinking differently now because I've had this new experience. That's part of this whole unfolding process too.
It's beautiful.
So releasing things like guilt and shame when it comes to feeling like you should be further along or you should be past a certain thing, because it's for you to unfold in this process according to when things come up for you.
And maybe we can do another video sometime on guilt and shame, because wow, can those things really affect us. And I've come to realize how many of us carry guilt and shame that isn't even ours to carry. It belongs to somebody else, but yet we don't know it until we know it. We're about time to wrap up. Any parting comments on ego?
Yeah. Don't be in competition with somebody else's ego.
No.
Don't be in competition with your own ego either.
No. Competition. That when we're talking, that word came to my head. I'm thinking that's probably what part of this is my ego competing with your ego, or my ego, just like Steve said, competing with yourself. It's a beautiful thing that we're learning how to work with this and work through it.
Mm-hmm.
In our previous video, I talked about when you're in the energy of the problem, you have to look to a different energy for a solution. If you focus on the problems and you just compete, you're just going to stay there. So when ego presents you with contrast, use that contrast to then pivot and focus on a solution out of it.
All right, so we are at time. Thank you all so much for watching today's episode, both on Awakening with Soulspirational and the Baird Soul YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, until next time, thank you, be well, and namaste.
Thank you.
Namaste.